right, so yeah, we're just going to jump right into this. There's really no easy way to introduce what we're going to talk about, and I'll talk about why that is in a second. Just because the story we're going to be telling today, it's a little upsetting, a little messed up. So we're gonna get into that. So what we've been doing so far for the last, I guess we're in week 4. We've been in this series on the book of Acts, and we're calling it we make the road by walking, like you just saw. And the reason we're calling it that is because this the whole book of Acts is a series of stories about what life was kind of like during the first generation of post-resurrection Jesus followers. So you have this group of people who have been a part of this movement. And Jesus eventually is arrested, killed, and resurrected. And so now you have this group of people who are orienting themselves around a new reality. And the new reality is, okay, we are in a post-resurrection world. And so now, what does it look like for us to create a new kind of story with this as the backdrop, with this sort of, as not just the backdrop, as the centerpiece of the whole thing, which is why we're calling this series, We Make the Road by Walking, because these guys, or these men and women, were figuring this whole thing out for the very first time. They were asking, like now we have thousands of years of tradition and story and experience, but at the time it was just like, what do we do? This whole thing is new. How do we create this thing that's all oriented around a post-resurrection reality? So that's what the whole book of Acts is oriented around. So one of the things that has happened is we've got this guy named Peter, which we did a whole series about back in July, who has now kind of risen to a point of leadership and prominence. So the question becomes, has Peter kind of evolved by this point? Has he changed? Has he softened? Has he become someone who is more tuned in to what's going on? And the story we're going to look at face value is going to maybe suggest like maybe not. Maybe Peter is still kind of harsh and difficult to work with. And so we're going to be looking at that. And like I said, and I cannot overemphasize this enough, the story we're looking at today is messed up and upsetting. And I'll tell you right now, we will not be able to resolve all of the tension that this story is going to create for us. However, I do believe that there is something useful to be found in this story. But I will say, again, it is upsetting. It is it's disturbing. It's one of those things like we don't really know exactly how to talk about it. In fact, if you were looking at other religious traditions and you were looking at different texts from those religious traditions and you found the story that we're looking at today in another religion, you would point at that story and say, like, see, this other religion is backwards and barbaric and messed up, and so that's why you shouldn't participate in this particular one. But this one's in our book, and so now we have to deal with it. So all that to say, we're going to be looking at this particular story in Acts chapter 5. However, before we can look at Acts chapter 5, we have to first look at Acts chapter 4, because Acts 4, originally in this text, the whole thing was written in Greek, and there was no chapter-verse breakdown that happened later. So originally, all of these stories were meant to flow together as one continuous narrative. So a thing that's going on in Acts chapter 4, to help us just sort of kind of set the stage, is you have lots of people at this time who are overtaxed. And we've talked about this a lot. Is at this time and in this place, in a Roman Empire-conquered Judean territory, you have lots of people who are being overtaxed by Caesar. And so you have people all over the place who have inherited land, like generation after generation after generation, who now are in an impossible situation where they're now having to sell off either all or parts of what they've inherited just in order to pay the taxes to Caesar, because everything is like the financial burden is almost unbearable for lots and lots of people at this time. So you have people who are starving to death, who once had things, but now that Caesar has taken over and is overtaxing people, now it becomes a question of like, well, what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to feed ourselves if we can't even pay the taxes that we owe? So the whole system, for a lot of people, feel like it's working against them. So in Acts chapter 4, we see that this early Jesus movement begins to respond to the needs of these types of people. So in Acts chapter 4, verse 32, it says this. It says, all the believers were one in heart and mind. No one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. With great power, the apostles continued to testify to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus. And God's grace was so powerfully at work in them all that there were no needy persons among them, which is remarkable, is it not? that you have this group of people, you have this entire community where people are starving, where people are being taxed into oblivion. And inside this group of people, or like where you have this group of people who are oriented around a post-resurrection, Jesus-centric narrative, you have this whole group of people saying, no one is going to starve to death while we're around. So it says there were no needy persons among them. In a world filled with needy people, it says among this group of people, that wasn't a problem because people were so overly generous. So it says, for from time to time, those who owned land or houses sold them, brought the money from the sales and put it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to anyone who had need. So the writer is showing us something, basically what is going on in the culture at large. So while most people at this time are going hungry and have to sell off everything that they have just to survive, there are a few people who have somehow managed to stay more financially secure than others for whatever reason. So lots of people are like being taxed into like zero margin situation, like deep into debt even. But somehow some people have been able to manage and save and make this, like basically sustain themselves even in the midst of this difficult situation. And the people who have done this, the people who are more fortunate are starting to sell off lots of their resources and bringing the money from those sales to help feed desperate and starving people. So you have a community of individuals who are coming together and saying, basically, no one starves to death on our watch. We are going to make sure everyone is taken care of, no matter the need, which is beautiful. Like this is one of those things of like, oh, this is a beautiful picture of how things could be in a community where people are truly supporting one another. And then, so the writer gives us sort of this macro view of this is what's going on all over the place inside this community. And then the writer zooms in and talks about one specific person as an example. Verse 36, it says, Joseph, a Levite from Cyprus, whom the apostles called Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, sold a field he owned and brought the money and put it at the apostles' feet. So there's this one guy named Joseph who is so generous, has given so much money and so much of his resources, has sold everything he's got, that not only is everyone just sort of like in awe of the generosity of this guy, they give him a nickname as a result of it. They start calling him Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, because he's been so generous and so over the top concerned about the needs of others. So Barnabas is like, again, becomes kind of a local celebrity as a result of his generosity. So the writer is painting a picture of this community where people are hungry and desperate, and the rest of the community rallies together to make sure that they are adequately taking care of each other. And so this is a beautiful picture that the writer is painting for us, which of course we ask the question, okay, so then what's so messed up and disturbing about this story? Well, we haven't gotten to that yet. So because for every good thing, quite often, we often find that there might be a dark side on the other side of it, which is what we're about to take a look at. So we have this beautiful picture painted, and we could just preach a sermon about this and about how great it is when people are generous, which is wonderful, and that could be the end of the sermon. But then it takes us to a really dark place. Now, again, remember, there is no division in terms of chapter breaks or anything. Like, we tend to sort of separate these because of how the chapters are broken up. But again, originally, in the original text, no breaks. Like, this comes on the heel, like the next thing comes right on the heels of the last thing. So let's say you're standing off to the side, like you're watching all of this happen. People are being generous. People are pouring themselves out. This guy even gets himself a new nickname just because he's so generous. You're watching all of this whole thing go down, and you maybe start to feel a little bit of, I don't know, call it jealousy, call it petty need for recognition, call it whatever you want. But maybe there's a part of your brain that starts to spin a little bit, and you start to think like, I would really like a lot of that, some of that attention, or a little bit of that attention if I could get it. I wouldn't mind a little nickname for how great and generous I am. That would be cool. So let's say you have that thought of, I'd really like the credit and the attention for how wonderful and generous I am, but I don't actually want to make any of the actual sacrifices that go along with that. So how can I get the credit but not actually do the work? That's what I'm trying. I'm trying to figure out how to sort of how to hack this particular situation, which is where we get to Acts chapter 5, which is where this story starts to take a dark turn. So in Acts chapter 5, verse 1, which is, again, right on the heels of what we just read about Barnabas. In verse 1, it says, now, a man named Ananias, which if you grew up in Sunday school, you maybe have heard this story, you know where we're going, and you're already like cringing and wishing you hadn't come today, which I totally get. So it says, now, a man named Ananias, together with his wife Sapphira, also sold a piece of property. With his wife's full knowledge, he kept back part of the money for himself, but brought the rest and put it at the apostles' feet. So This is meant to sort of kind of echo a little bit of the Barnabas story, because Barnabas has done something similar, but where it breaks down is it says he held some of it back and then brought the rest of it, as if to basically present as if he's giving everything when really he's only giving part of it. So then in verse 3, it says, then Peter said, Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and kept for yourself some of the money you received for the land? Now, we've talked before about how this word Satan, often we kind of picture like a cartoon, like a guy in red pajamas with a pitchfork. That's not really what this word is. In Hebrew, this is ha-satan, which literally means accuser or obstruction, something that is sort of getting in the way of what is meant to be a very like natural progression. So basically, like, we're all on this journey here, and Peter is saying, like, Ananias, you're kind of like in the way. Like you're kind of you're doing this thing that's meant to look good, but you're kind of like blocking us from doing the thing that we're actually trying to do because you're so concerned with the recognition that you're getting. It's kind of the subtext here. And so then in verse 4, it says, didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? What made you think of doing such a thing? You have not lied just to human beings, but to God. And this is when I wish this story wasn't in the Bible. In verse 5, it says, when Ananias heard this, he fell down and died, which feels like a lot. Like, that's extreme, I would think. And then it says, and great fear seized all who heard what had happened. Then some young men came forward, wrapped up his body, and carried him out and buried him. Somebody after the last service was like, what if he's just like narcoleptic? And like maybe like later he just like wakes up like, why am I wrapped up like this? But no, it seems like he died. So now we have to deal with this story, which again, truly upsetting. Now, I have heard, and you can probably see where this is going. Maybe you grew up in a situation where you've heard it preached this way too. I have heard pastors preach this sermon or this passage as if it was basically a threat against people who don't give enough money. You know what I mean? So this passage I have heard preached, and you will hear a pastor say, like, look, I'm not saying this is going to happen to you, but like maybe you're not giving enough. And if you're not giving enough, God might just have to kill you. So there's that's a thing you're just going to have to deal with. And it becomes like, again, like a threat, like, nice little life you got going on here. Be ashamed if something happened to it. So here's the offering basket just to make sure. So that is, let me just go ahead and set us all free from that right now. That is not what this story is about. This story is not about like, you need to give more money. Anytime somebody uses this story for that, they are A, not paying attention, and B, using it to manipulate you to give them more money. That is not what this story is. The problem in this story is not Ananias didn't give enough, that he owed something to them. The problem is not at all that Ananias, that he should have given more than he did. Look back at verse 3, because Peter's words here kind of give that away. In verse 3, it says, Peter said to Ananias, how is it that Satan has so filled your heart that you have lied to the Holy Spirit and have kept for yourself some of the money that you received for the land? Didn't it belong to you before it was sold? And after it was sold, wasn't the money at your disposal? In other words, Peter's problem is not you didn't give enough. Peter's problem is that Ananias is presenting a false reality to everybody around him. What Ananias wants is to look like he's doing something that he's not doing. Ananias wants to make it look like he's giving more than he really is, which, again, the result continues to be upsetting, but for a different reason than maybe we would assume at first glance. So this is not a story about someone who isn't giving enough. This is a story about the impulse to make other people think that we are something that we're not, especially if it involves other people's most deeply held beliefs as a tool to manipulate them. So if you have ever been in a situation where it felt like someone was using like flowery, Jesus-y, religious-sounding language in order to get you to like agree with them about something, or in order to get you to do something for them, or to recognize them for something that they want to be recognized for. If someone's ever used language about Jesus, not because they had any sort of like conviction or belief in it, but because they thought maybe they could use it to get you to vote like they do. You know what I'm saying? Like maybe that's actually what we're getting at here. This is about taking what people believe is good and using it to manipulate them in order to make yourself feel bigger and better. This is not an issue of Ananias didn't give enough. This is Ananias is trying to make himself the star of the show. And that is a real problem, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to feed and clothe people who are desperate. And so Ananias has seen this situation and realized, oh, I can use this to my own advantage. I can make myself a really big deal and trick people into thinking that I'm participating in a way that I am not. So, have you ever been in a situation where you had been in a church environment, or maybe you were invited to a church, maybe you were invited to this church, and your first response to that was like, I don't go to church because I can't stand to be around people who are just completely fake and hypocritical. I think this is a very old story that is trying to say, like, yeah, that's not a new problem. Like, this is a very, very old problem. Like, the need to build ourselves up and to create a platform for ourselves to become great in the eyes of others by using language about Jesus and service. Like, that takes us to a very, very dark place. When someone uses language about Jesus or faith to try to manipulate people, it can get very, very dark very fast. When someone takes something that is good or holy or beautiful, like trying to feed or clothe people who need it, and then they try to use that for their own particular personal advantages, there is something particularly upsetting about that. We all sense it when that kind of thing is happening, and we don't like it. And Peter is saying, this is not what the story is about. You don't get to do that here. We are here to feed people who are starving and comfort people who are desperate. And you are coming in here and trying to leverage our situation for your own personal gain. And again, not a new impulse at all. We've seen this a lot. In fact, if you want to rewind, we're going to go back to the book of Amos. This is an ancient Hebrew prophet. I realize everybody has it memorized. We're going to look at it anyway. And so in the book of Amos, what you have is you have people in this society who are harming other people for their own personal gain, and then they are hiding behind religious faith in order to make themselves feel better in the aftermath of it. And one of the specific examples that Amos gives, and he talks about a lot of different, some variations on how this is playing out. But one of the things he talks about is that there are people in their midst who are starving, and they barely have enough money to pay for grain. And so one of the things that people who are selling grain have started to do is they'll start taking like wood shavings and like fill the bags, like the grain bags, with the wood shavings to make it weigh more, so they can charge people more. And so they're selling people wood shavings inside the grain just to make a profit. So they're harming people on any number of levels. But then also the same group of people, according to Amos, are going into like sacred, holy religious spaces and offering like big flowery language about how much they love to serve God and how much they love to participate in this kind of thing. And Amos is having none of it. Amos has no patience for someone who will do harm to other people and then hide behind religious faith as a way to excuse themselves. So in Amos chapter 5, verse 21, this prophet, speaking on behalf of God, says, I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps, but let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. What's he saying? He's saying, listen, if you're in the business of doing harm to people, don't bother coming into this space and pretending like you have this deep, abiding faith in something bigger than yourself, because you're using that as a tool to hide the fact that you are harming people, that you are exploiting the needs of others. This is a God who has no patience for religious posturing when we are in the business of bringing harm to others. And so if you want to fast forward a little bit, going back to the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 23, by the way, if you ever want to see Jesus like truly cranked up, anytime somebody is using religious language or religious tradition as a means of harming other people or as a means of excluding or manipulating people, Jesus is having none of it. So in Matthew chapter 23, the entire 23rd chapter of Matthew, by the way, is just Jesus like completely letting people have it for exactly this impulse. So in Matthew 23, verse 27, Jesus says this. He says, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. Now, what's going on? What kind of language is Jesus using here? Now, this is actually a very specific cultural metaphor that Jesus is using. At this time and in this place, first century Judean area in Jerusalem, you would have multiple times a year, you would have people who would come to the temple from all over the surrounding regions in order to participate in specific religious festivals. And one of the problems, though, was about 300 yards away from the temple, there was a graveyard. And so one of the things that would happen is as people who don't really know the area around Jerusalem were coming into to worship in the temple, one of the things that would happen is people would accidentally step on graves on their way into the temple, which is a problem because one of the things in Torah that is mentioned is if you come into contact with a dead body, then you are ceremonially unclean for 7 days, which means you can't go into the temple. So imagine traveling hundreds of miles to get to the temple for a particular festival. You are 300 yards away from the temple, and the guy you're walking next to says, uh-oh, and looks down, and to see you are standing on a grave. Now, the whole trip was wasted because now you can't go any closer to the temple because you are now unclean for 7 days. So what people started to do was they would go out a little bit ahead of time before any of these major festivals, and they would begin to treat the outside of these tombs with a particular type of solution that would turn the graves, at least temporarily, would turn them white. And the reason they would need to turn them white, obviously, is because they don't want people to come all the way to worship in the temple and to not be able to come into the temple. So it was basically just a way of kind of painting warning signs all over the place, like, hey, watch your step. You are in a graveyard. Don't step on the white tombs. Otherwise, you will then become unclean. So they made the outsides of these tombs look nicer, but it didn't change the fact that the reason they did that was to warn people not to come into contact with them. So Jesus comes to the group of religious leaders and basically says, hey, you know those tombs that you are obsessed with making sure nobody comes into contact with? That's you. So super loaded language that Jesus starts using as a result of a lot of the manipulation and exploitation going on at this time. So changing the outside of the tomb doesn't change the fact that inside it is still filled with death and decay. So it is possible, Jesus is pointing this out, it is possible to be totally committed to the process of being religious and the language and posturing that comes along with that, and to still completely miss out on what is going on just beneath the surface. It is possible to know all the right words and phrases and to use them to get all kinds of recognition and to still be filled with death and decay. It is possible to know exactly what to say and how to behave and still to be a whitewashed tomb. So that's what's going on in the story. So I think the story, going back to Ananias now, I think the story, I would argue, the story of Ananias is a story about what happens when something that is going on the inside begins to show up on the outside. I would argue this is a story that is telling us Ananias is a whitewashed tomb. He already was filled with death and decay way before he sold his property. The only thing that happened is that his body begins to reflect what's already going on in his soul. This story, again, obviously very upsetting. And again, we will not be able to resolve all the tension that is found. You will not feel better about this story when we're done. But this story was used as a way to communicate to the early church, we are not here for our own self-aggrandizement. We are not here to put ourselves up on a pedestal and make everybody else think about how great we are. The point of this is not for us to become local celebrities or to get like a speaking tour or a book deal or any of those kinds of things. The point of this is none of that. And if that's what you're here for, you may already be a little bit dead inside. So Ananias was a whitewashed tomb way before he thought about selling his property. But it does get worse. And so we'll jump into Acts chapter 5, verse 7, right after they carry Ananias' body out. In verse 7, it says, about 3 hours later, his wife came in, not knowing what had happened. Peter asked her, and of course we're watching this like a horror movie, like don't do it, please don't do it. And then in verse 8 it says, Peter asked her, tell me, is this the price you and Ananias got for the land? Yes, she said, that is the price. Peter said to her, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? Listen, the feet of the men who buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out also. At that moment, she fell down at his feet and died. Then the young men came in, and finding her dead, carried her out and buried her beside her husband. So, again, we don't feel better right? Like no one in here is like, okay, yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. Like, no, like why? Why was that second part necessary? Like, was the first half of this story not upsetting enough? Did we really need to just continue making it worse? And which, I mean, raises lots of questions about how do we feel about Peter after this? Like, is Peter baiting her? Is Peter hoping he'll catch her in a lie so that she'll drop dead, just like her husband did? Like, what in the world are we seeing happen here? So is Peter like feeling like, gotcha? Or is he offering her an opportunity to choose a different path? Like you could read it either way. You could read it like, oh, Peter feels like a little bit satisfied that he caught her in a lie. Or you could read it in terms of maybe Peter's grieved that she, like, look at what he says. He says, how could you conspire to test the Spirit of the Lord? You could read it like, how could you? Or you could read it like, oh, how could you? You know what I mean? Like, you could read this either way. Now, again, there's lots of things that are upsetting about this, and this is, okay. So at this time, it was not uncommon to have a situation in which a man who is married does something that would warrant some kind of serious consequence, and as a result of that, they would assume his wife had been a co-conspirator, and so she would automatically get the same consequence as him, you know, because of patriarchy. And so you would have this situation in which a wife would automatically, without any questions, be penalized for the crimes of her husband. This was not an uncommon thing that would happen in the first century. And so that was just a thing that would happen, that she would automatically sort of be just tacked on to whatever happened to him. So it was rare to see a man commit an offense and then go to the wife separately and ask her to speak for herself. So when Peter says to the wife, to Sapphira, is this really the price that you received? I don't love her answer, and I really don't love what happens to her next. But this may, weirdly, go with me here, this may be the most progressive part of this story, because the wife in this particular situation is given an opportunity to speak for herself. We don't love it. It's definitely upsetting and not a thing I want to spend a whole lot of time like hoping to see more of, but it's also like, okay, well, at the very least, she was given an opportunity to speak for herself, which is, again, weirdly progressive for its time. So when Peter says, how could you conspire? We assume he's acting like he caught her, again, like he's got her. But again, I don't think I would argue that's not how we're meant to read the tone. I think it's meant to be grieved. I think what we're supposed to see here is that Peter is hoping that she'll give a different answer, that she will be given an opportunity to speak for herself and choose a better way to proceed. So the story is tragic, and I think Peter understands the weight of the tragedy in the story, because this is a story about two people who, because of a desire to be celebrated, revered, put on a pedestal, given a cool nickname, whatever, these are people who are filled with death. These are people who are filled with decay. This is a story about two people who are dead inside way before they ever sold any property. This is a story about two whitewashed tombs. And so when you see someone go into a church or any other kind of Jesus-centered space, and that person starts using language to try and get those people to give them something or do something for them, what you're seeing is actually very old. Now, this being an election year, we have no connections to make in real life about people who would use religious language to get us to do something that we wouldn't necessarily be inclined to do. But, you know, you can use your imagination and imagine what it might be like to see that kind of thing happen from time to time. So you have this situation where you have someone using like religious actions and language to try and get other people to recognize them, do something for them, give them a nickname, whatever. And Peter is saying that's not, you've stepped into the wrong story, if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. And then in verse 11, the story ends with this. It says, great fear seized the whole church and all who heard about these events, which of course it did. Now, I don't like this story. I told you, like right from the jump, I do not like this story. And it turns out neither did any of the people who heard it originally. Like everybody had problems with this story. By the way, just as an aside, this does not happen a lot in what we refer to as the New Testament. This is actually the only, other than a parable that Jesus tells, which is not meant to be taken literally, this is the only time in the entire New Testament that someone does something and then they just die as a result of it. So this is an incredibly rare event, which makes us, we have to stop and just ask like, there is something extreme going on here, and we have to sort of begin to reckon with, why would this be the event that would set that off? And it isn't because someone didn't give enough. It's because someone entered into a space where people are being fed and clothed, where people are desperate, and they started asking questions about, how can I make this about me? And how can I orient this thing to my benefit? And Peter is saying, yeah, you've entered the wrong story. if that's the kind of thing you're looking for. I wonder if one of the reasons people had such strong reactions at the time, other than the obvious reasons, is that they were all, I would imagine most of the people who first heard this story had to face the question, is there any of that in me? Is there any bit of me that can more deeply identify with this than I would like? It is easy to come down hard on Ananias and Sapphira. In fact, we almost have to. We almost have to dehumanize them in order to make the story just a little bit bearable. But the truth is, there's a little bit of that in most of us, probably. There's a little bit of, I wonder if anybody's looking, and will that make a difference in whether or not I do the right thing here or not? The best example I can think of is a very old reference to a TV show that most people under 20 have never heard of. So there was this, in the 90s, there was a show called Seinfeld. It was very popular. You're going to have to take my word for it. And one of the characters in the show Seinfeld was a guy named George. And there's an episode of Seinfeld where George he has a favorite new restaurant that he's been going to that sells calzones. And there's a tip jar at the counter. And he starts feeling like people are giving him dirty looks for not leaving a tip. And so one day he decides to leave a really big tip so that the people who work there will think he's a really great guy. But the problem is he starts to drop the tip in the jar just as the guy behind the counter turns his back to him. And so George has to reach back into the tip jar and pull the tip back out, which of course the guy sees, and now he's banned from the store, and hilarity ensues. But the point of that is there's a little bit of George in all of us, right? Like, if I'm going to leave the tip, I need you to know that I left the tip. If I'm going to do something generous, I'm going to have somebody recognize that I did it. Otherwise, why did I do it at all? And so that's kind of where we're at with the Ananias story, is like, if you're doing something, and if you're doing something good or generous or kind for somebody, but you know you would not be doing it if the recognition weren't part of the package, then there is a whitewashed tomb element to it. I would argue that the best Bible stories can comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, which is not a new sentiment. This is a very old expression. And I think this story really does both. And we can obviously see how it would afflict the comfortable, because this is a jarring story. But if I'm leveraging my faith or exploiting somebody else's faith in order to gain something for myself, I am like a whitewashed tomb. This story should be sobering to me. But then there's also the other side of like, well, then how does it comfort the afflicted? Because maybe you're entering into these spaces and you feel like you have to pretend. And you have to engage as if I am something that I'm not. And I think this story is a way of saying like, no, that's not the story we're telling. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to pretend to be bigger, better, more generous, whatever, than you are. You can just come and be yourself. I completely believe that if Ananias and Sapphira had sold their property and then said to Peter, listen, here's a percentage of what we made from the sale. We're going to hang on to the rest for whatever reason. I think Peter easily would have said, great, thank you. We'll see you next week or whatever. I don't think it would have been a problem. But the problem becomes when it feels like we have to pretend, that we have to present ourselves as something that we're not. I know pastors who preach every single week and will tell you privately, like, I don't talk about anything. I never tell stories about myself in which I'm not the hero, basically. And the reason is, like, if I'm going to be up here talking and representing the Bible, then I need to present as if I have the whole thing figured out and I have it all together. And I can't let anybody see that I'm struggling with like my mental health, or I'm asking questions about what it means to be a good parent, or that I'm having like doubts about the things that I've always assumed were true. Like, and so there's this need to present as if everything is not the way it is. And I think the story is a cautionary tale, as if to say, not like you're going to like drop dead as a result, but as a way of saying, like, doesn't that kind of make you into a whitewashed tomb? Aren't you not presenting a thing that is not real? I can tell you from my own experience, I used to work at a really big church. And at a certain point while I was working there, towards the end of my time there, even though I didn't realize it was the end of my time there, I started really struggling with a lot of things. I started really like dissecting and deconstructing my faith. And I foolishly told a coworker of mine who outranked me on the org chart. And what he said to me was, listen, don't tell anybody. Because what we don't need around here is for people to think that the staff is having doubts. And we don't want anybody to think that the staff doesn't fully 100% believe all the things that we as a church believe. And so just keep it to yourself. And so we were going to a small group every week. We were friends with people, and I was under orders to be a whitewashed tomb. The instruction was, don't tell anybody. We can't let anybody know. So on the inside, I'm like unraveling. Like I'm having all sorts of questions and doubts. Like, what do I even believe about? Like, what do I even think about all these questions? But on the outside, I have to be a good soldier. I have to be a good church staff member in whatever way that looks. I felt like a whitewashed tomb. I felt like I was dying on the inside. And I think this story is a way of saying, like, yeah, you don't actually have to do that. You don't have to pretend to be something that you're not. You don't have to walk around like a whitewashed tomb. So maybe you're haunted by the need for everyone to think that you've got it all together, when just below the surface, you are unraveling. Maybe you're broken and nobody knows it. I think this story is an invitation to say, like, yeah, you don't actually have to live like that. You can be honest. And I recognize, like, not everyone is a safe person, and you can't just, like, get up in front of everyone and tell them every single thing, which is clearly what I always do, but you don't have to do that. But I recognize, but you have to, at the very least, be able and free to be truthful about what's going on inside of you with somebody. So I think the invitation of the story is, one, you don't have to live in a space where you feel like you have to posture and you have to prop yourself up, that you can just enter into the space however you are, and that is okay. Because the problem with Ananias isn't that he didn't give enough. The problem is that he came in under false pretenses, and he pretended to be something that he wasn't. And he was dead inside way before he walked into the room. So may we read this story and hear the invitation. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to perform. You don't have to trick people into liking you. You don't have to live like a whitewashed tomb. You can simply enter into the space and be exactly as you are, and it's okay. And for those of us who feel the need, like we lack value until someone gives us a cool nickname or recognizes the massive contribution that we're making, may we be set free from the need for that approval and the need for that recognition. May we give ourselves permission to not be the center of attention all the time and to simply participate in the story that's going on all around us already. May we find that there's something bigger than just our own self-aggrandizement. May we recognize that the story is much better than that.